Welcome back. You are tuned into Public Space Sri Lanka. Public Space Sri Lanka goes in depth on Sri Lankan politics, culture and economics, and today we are discussing about the free trade agreements, and specifically before the break we discussed about some of the conditions on free trade agreement we inked with Singapore few weeks ago, and Kit Mina was explaining how important to look at the overall picture when you go for a free trade agreement rather than just comparing the trade balances between two countries. That is where we stopped. Kit Mina, I would like to go in depth on the Singapore Free Trade Agreement. Give us shed some light on what are the conditions, what are the categories mentioned in this free trade agreement. Let us provide sort of a background to our dear viewers on the free trade agreement with Singapore and Sri Lanka.
Right. There are three main aspects of the agreement. So, one is trade in goods. Like I said before, Singapore has already liberalized 99% of its total exports imports into the country. So it we don't expect a big kind of influence in that term in terms of goods exports from Sri Lanka to Singapore. From the Sri Lankan side, we will be liberalizing 50% of our tariff lines immediately, and then it will improve to 80% in 12 years time and 90% in 15 years time. So it basically allows Sri Lanka a lot of space to liberalize and kind of allow local companies as well to adjust to this liberalization that happens. What's most important in this sense is that Sri Lanka is not reducing tariffs on petroleum products and petroleum imports from Singapore. So that's the biggest import from Singapore into Sri Lanka right now. But petroleum based products and that area is not liberalized, which means that there won't be much of a negative impact on tax or tariff revenue either. So which is one of the big concerns when we liberalize trade in terms of tariff revenue, but this biggest kind of import from Singapore is not liberalized. It will continue, the current levels of tariff will continue to apply for that import. The second chapter is, or the second main chapter is in regards to trade in services. Now there are few sectors that Sri Lanka and Singapore have identified in terms of what will be liberalized and in terms of how it will be liberalized. So some of these sectors are tourism, for example. We already see Singaporean investment, for example, Shangri-La in Sri Lanka, but we expect that to increase once the FTA kicks in. Second, things like IT and telecommunications, where Singapore has a competitive advantage across the world. Singaporean firms are very prominent in terms of this sector in IT and also education, and construction. So these sort of service sectors are also going to be liberalized, and we expect Singaporean firms to come in to Sri Lanka. The third thing, and I would say this is the most important part, is the investment chapter that has been included, and this is the first time that Sri Lanka has included a services and an investment chapter in one of its FTAs. And this investment chapter is twofold. One is that it creates, it liberalizes and creates kind of a more business friendly environment for Singaporean investment coming into the country, but importantly it creates a dispute settlement mechanism between Singapore and Sri Lanka. Which means that one of the big issues that are one of the huge bottlenecks for FDI in Sri Lanka is the legal process, the prolonged legal processes in terms of dispute settlement. If you look at the World Bank's doing business index, ease of doing business index, and the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness report, the time taken for legal action is one of the big constraints. It takes around 3.5 years on average, if I'm not mistaken. So having this dispute settlement mechanism makes it easy and creates a framework that is consistent, that won't change just because the government changes, that is consistently applied, and it provides the security needed for investors from Singapore, and also creates the necessary framework for Sri Lankan investors if they want to go into Singapore as well. So those are the three main pillars of this FTA and some of the key highlights of it.
Okay, Kit Mina, I would like to start from the trading of goods component of this FTA. You mentioned in terms of petroleum products, we haven't changed any of the tariff rates. My question is, at the same time, we are opening up about 90% in 15 years for Singapore, but Singapore has already opened for 99% for our products. So, in terms of what's the impact on the tariff revenue from Singapore, since we are opening up to the entire economy? That's number one. Number two is, what's the impact on not opening up the petroleum products for Singapore? What would be the impact for the local consumer? What would be the impact for the, in terms of global trade perspective?
In terms of your first question, in regards to opening up the economy as a whole, there are three factors that will. One is that the consumers, the everyday common man, the 21 million of us that are in the country, will get cheaper products. The cost of living will reduce because now imports from Singapore will be at a lower cost. And this is something that doesn't get discussed much when you talk about FTAs, because consumers don't create unions, consumers don't go on protests. But the fact of the matter is that trade liberalization actually reduces the cost of living for people and citizens of a country. And that's the biggest, I think, benefit. In terms of the rest, like I said, petroleum products is the biggest tariff revenue good in terms of imports to Sri Lanka. And because that is not liberalized, we don't expect a massive hit on tax tariff revenue. Obviously, a better calculation can be made once the trade agreement has been made public in, I think, March it's supposed to, because right now they are exchanging diplomatic notes. So then there will be a better calculation, an exact calculation of what the tariff revenue impact is. But because petroleum products is the biggest revenue maker right now, and because that is on the negative list, we don't expect a huge tariff revenue reduction. But in terms of, when you look at it on a net, I think even though Singapore has already opened up its goods imports from Sri Lanka already, the important part is linked to investment. If Singaporean investors, manufacturing and all that, come into Sri Lanka and create and produce factories in Sri Lanka that re-export to Singapore, I think that's when you will see an increase in export revenue through goods. And I think that's what Sri Lanka is counting on. And not just Singaporean imports, but also third parties. So countries like Japan, the Middle East, other South Asian countries who don't have access to the Singaporean market in the way that we do, would find it beneficial to come and invest in Sri Lanka, start those productions, add value, and then get into the ASEAN market through Singapore. So that, I think, is a longer term impact, and that's, I think, where exports will be impacted mostly for Sri Lanka.
Just to clarify, Kitmina, what do you mean by when you say petroleum products? Could you kindly be a little bit specific on what are the product items on this under the broad theme of petroleum products?
So some of it is kind of petroleum that is being created or imported into Sri Lanka through Singapore, and also in terms of other like some of the other products that is linked to the petroleum industry. The exact details, I mean, will be made public next month, but generally petroleum related and affiliated.
Great. In terms of the service sector involvement, so what would be the opportunity or the probability of Singaporeans coming and working here, because some of the professional organizations already sort of made concerns whether this would lose make an impact on the local industries, local employment, where the people from overseas come and take their job opportunities, sort of some sort of a concern. What are your thoughts on that when opening up the service sector, which is, as you mentioned, it's not the trading of goods, it's the service sector and the investment sector. What would be the impact on the employment?
Right. In terms of addressing the big concern, if Singaporeans can just decide to come to Sri Lanka and work, that doesn't happen under this FTA. So that is basically mode 4 liberalization. If you look at kind of the GATS, the Trading Services Agreement, the World Trade under the WTO, mode 4 is not liberalized under the Singapore-Sri Lanka FTA. I think that should be made very clear. What has been allowed is that intra-company transfers So, for example, if when Shangri-La comes into Sri Lanka, someone, a CEO or a director in Shangri-La can, or a manager, a hotel manager from Singapore under Shangri-La can come and work in Sri Lanka in the hotel as a manager. So, intra-company transfers will be available. However, Singaporean nationals can't just willy-nilly come into Sri Lanka and work. The second aspect I think it's important to kind of highlight is that this agreement is limited to the nationals of Singapore and Sri Lanka. So nationals of other countries can't come through a Singaporean company into Sri Lanka and work. The agreement is very clear and limits itself to nationals of the two countries, so Sri Lankans and Singaporean nationals. And this is, there are two aspects when it comes to Mode 4 or kind of labor liberalization. One is the European Union system where Mode 4 has been liberalized, which means that anyone within the European Union can just travel wherever they want and start working. That is not happening in this case. What we have is investment coming in, and people in these companies, so intra-company transfers and similar transfers will happen. And it honestly will increase the quality of the labor, if at all, and it will also allow us to get more information and knowledge, and that's an important part of this entire process as well.
Okay. Kitmina, anyway, when two parties going into an agreement, it could be you and I or two countries, we know it's finding the win-win forte or finding the win-win overlapping area is, you know, somewhat limited, because I need my conditions to be better, you need your conditions to be better. So, in terms of finding what do you say, an agreement, what are your thoughts on, you know, what are the things we are losing, I would say, by going to a free trade agreement? Of course, there will be benefits for both the countries. Of course, we have to sacrifice certain things when it comes to an agreement. It's not like we are getting everything that we want, neither Singapore. So, just shed light on, okay, what are the things that we have to sacrifice, or what I would ask, what things would make concern for the locals by going to this agreement?
That's a very important question, because I think more often than not when we talk about FTAs, we talk about the positives only. And as a result, the general public is given a false impression, and then people who are protectionists are able to kind of say, listen, that's not what they promised. There are obviously certain compromises that have been made, and obviously, like I said before, when you liberalize trade, there is a negative impact on tariff revenue. There is no doubting about that. There is going to be an impact. It's just that the impact is lessened by the fact that we are not reducing tariffs on our biggest import from Singapore. But there will be a loss of revenue in that sense. But then we need to compare that to the gains that are made through investment and exports. So that's, I think, has to be dealt with separately. Then obviously I think that the second and kind of the more important part is that there will be certain Sri Lankan firms that are not competitive, that have benefited from maybe certain protectionist measures over the years, that won't be able to compete against international competition. The issue is that in the grander scheme of things, we need to look at what is net, if it's a net benefit to the economy. Yes, some firms might lose out, but in the grander scheme of things, does it create more job opportunities in Sri Lanka? Does it create more investment in Sri Lanka? And I think in this case, we can see a net benefit to the economy. And I think given that there is a time period, there's a lag of 12 to 15 years, it allows Sri Lankan firms that are currently benefiting from certain protectionists and kind of taking things for granted, so to speak, to evolve and become more competitive. And I think that's an important part, because the Sri Lankan market is 21 million. From any comparison or calculation, that is not a big market. And as long as we want to compete only at 21 million, this economy is going to remain stagnant. So we need to look at the wider market. And as Singapore themselves have proven, and we love comparing ourselves to want to become Singapore. You ask any politician, I'm sure at least half of them who are here may have spoken about how they want to become the next Singapore. So when you want to become the next Singapore, there are certain sacrifices that have to be made. And as Singapore themselves have proven, when a small country can liberalize and create net benefits to its economy and grow the way they did. And I think those compromises have to be made by individuals like us, as well as an economy and kind of from a policy perspective as well.
Okay. On going for an agreement, I think our general dear viewers have no idea on how this trade negotiation process happens. Of course, your chairman from Center for at IPS, Professor Razin Sali, if I remember right, made a comment, especially some of the weaknesses we have when we go as a team to negotiate certain conditions. I just wanted to highlight and bring your attention, especially when we are negotiating with a country like Singapore, where GDP per capita GDP is higher than us and somewhat open and having a better recognition than Sri Lanka, sort of lot of positivity when you compare Singapore and Sri Lanka. So, what's the process of these negotiations, and do you think, especially to negotiate a free trade agreement with Singapore, are we capable? Or I mean, not I don't mean the capabilities of the personal capacity, but when you are going as a country, especially with the macroeconomic status we are currently in, do we have to sacrifice more compared to Singapore?
Just to clarify Dr. Sali's comments, Dr. Razin Sali was commenting on the benefits of unilateral liberalization over specific FTA based liberalization.
Okay.
And he was talking that maybe we could do more liberalization through the FTAs. So I think it's not a case of the negotiating being weak, but rather that we should have gone for a more higher kind of and liberalize more. And this is something that the policymakers as well as everyone involved has to kind of consider. If we do liberalize fast, then there's an impact. The impact on the economy is going to be faster, and there may be job losses or the negative impacts could become faster and we won't be able to respond adequately. Whereas when it's kind of dragged on for a while more, it gives more scope for the economy to respond. Now for in this case 12 to 15 years and so on. So there are two, like I said as we started off, there are two ways of going about it. So it's not that the capacity is kind of lower. In terms of smaller economies or kind of more developed economies and developing economies, there are plenty of examples around the world where there have been such FTAs that have benefited the world. The best one being NAFTA, where Mexico was able to negotiate with the USA and Canada, and Mexico has gained incredibly from that agreement. Similarly, when it comes to Sri Lanka and Singapore, there are two things that are important. One is that Singapore was willing to give Sri Lanka what we call special and differential treatment. So recognizing that Sri Lanka is at a lower stage of development than they are, they have given us a lot more time, kind of a lot more leeway in terms of what we are getting out of this agreement. So like I said, Singapore has already liberalized 99% of tariff immediately, whereas we get 12 to 15 years to liberalize and not even to that extent. In the same way, Singapore has kind of conceded and compromised on petroleum related imports. So because Singapore, it's not just about trade, it's also about strategic foresight. And in terms of where we see ourselves, and particularly as a base in South Asia for more kind of diverse trade, given our strategic location, Singapore sees Sri Lanka as a potential hub in the region to trade more with India, Pakistan, and even the Middle East and East Africa. So Singaporean firms, particularly the small and medium enterprises. So for example, Singaporean firms may not be able to compete in a big market like India, small and medium enterprises. Whereas in Sri Lanka, they are able to become better. They are able to grow faster and they are able to create the necessary frameworks. So that's, I think, the bigger, most important part, that Singapore has provided us special and differential treatment. Secondly, in terms of capacity, yes, Singapore is a much developed country and they have more experience, but I would definitely stand by the negotiating team that Sri Lanka sent. That is a very qualified team that has experience, not just locally but globally in terms of negotiating with Singapore. And I think as Singapore and Sri Lanka have agreed, this is, like you said before, this is a win-win situation for the two economies.
Okay, I would like to bring your attention to the investment side of the free trade agreement, Kitmina. Now, just shed light on here. Now, in terms of investment, so one of the reasons, since we are anyway giving up on the goods, trading of goods and basically goods, and we are mainly focusing on services and investment. The reason I think we are getting the investment side highlighted is expecting that Singaporean will come here and invest, so there will be more employment opportunities, and also the other countries who is looking for an access to Singapore through Sri Lanka will also come and invest here. But if you look at Singapore is also equally a small country as Sri Lanka. Once on the same seat, Dr. Dayan Jayatilaka said, you can't compare Sri Lanka versus Singapore because Singapore is like Colombo. It's like we are comparing Colombo with Singapore is possible, but Sri Lanka and Singapore is sort of a not possible scenario. But however, so do we get that expected impact by opening, expecting more on investment side, whether actually investment would come in, since Singapore is also a small market. If 21 million is a small market, would Singapore would also classify as a small market, so people would not be very much interested on investing here because again you are exporting to a smaller market. What are your thoughts on that?
Singapore is a small market in terms of its population. It has a population of about 5 million, and like you said, it's about size of Colombo. But the important part is that their GDP is at least 30 times more than Sri Lanka's, entirety of Sri Lanka, not just Colombo. And that's the important part, that we are able to export to a market that is richer, that is more dynamic, and where they are careful and then where they are committed to more service-oriented imports. And that's what they kind of the access that they want, and that's what they've been consuming a lot. So when you talk about services imports like IT industries, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 million or 5 million or so on. What matters is, are they able to buy it? So for example, the best example I can give is the difference between maybe selling a low-end phone that we used when we were in high school, right, versus a more high-tech smartphone that we have right now. It's the same as you can equate them by selling more of the low-income phones, or you can sell less, more high-tech, more expensive phones. And in this case, that's what we are looking at. There's a smaller market, but they are a lot richer, and they are more willing to buy up those services in IT. They are more willing to get into the services such as tourism and education and so on. And I think that's the important part.
So what you mean is we have the opportunity to export high value products to Singapore rather than just sending the same basket that we have been exporting for some time, where we can export more complex products which are high in value.
Exactly. And for example, I mean, if you look at the apparel industry, Sri Lanka no longer exports as much as the low end apparels that maybe Bangladesh exports. Sri Lanka exports a more high tech kind of wearable tech is, I think, is what is being used right now, and that's sort of like high end apparels. So higher value apparels bring in more revenue than exporting a lot of lower end. In the same way, exporting those higher value added exports to Singapore is what will bring in the revenue to Sri Lanka.
Any other important factors that you would like to highlight on the Singapore and Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement, Kitmina, before we move on to the other parts of the free trade agreements? We are discussing about a free trade agreement with China, Indonesia, and also with India, the ECTA. Before we move on to that, any other important parts that within the available information, we hope that we will get the information in March, but before that, any other parts that you would like to highlight on the Sri Lanka Singapore Free Trade Agreement?
The other part that I guess I didn't specifically say much is in terms of there's a government procurement chapter as well, where the Singapore FTA has opened up, has allowed Singaporean firms to compete with Sri Lankan firms for government procurement, but at a very limited scope. The important part is that this creates more transparency. One of the big issues that we have in this country is a lack of transparency, particularly when it comes to how governments work, and this is a complaint that locals all over from the entire spectrum will make. So in terms of opening it up to international competition, in terms of setting those standards, we are showing the world and we are making that signal that government procurement is going to be more transparent. You can't bribe someone and get something done, because then the Singaporean firm will be able to bring a dispute mechanism against the country. So that's an important part. It's the impact of this is not just economic but also social and political, where we create better governance structures in the country as a whole by allowing government procurement to be liberalized and allowing that for international competition.
Okay. Just final question on the Singapore Free Trade Agreement. What would be the developments? You mentioned about the IT sector, the telco sector, and the electronics products. What would be the expected benefit other than tourism, especially for IT and telco, since Singaporeans are somewhat tech-savvy nation? What are the expected impact on those two sectors?
I think we expect investment to come in and facilitate areas that Sri Lanka are already quite competitive or growing in terms of providing IT services or kind of software and kind of moving on from there, or even kind of KPO, so accounting and legal services sector, or to a lesser extent the BPO sector. So I think those sort of IT related services or sectors is what we expect most investment in, because that is something that, and telecommunications, where Singapore is good at, and Singapore is interested in creating linkages between Sri Lanka and Singapore.
That was Kitmir Hevage. He was explaining about the conditions of Sri Lanka and Singapore Free Trade Agreement. After the break, we are planning to dig deep into ECTA as well as other free trade agreements Sri Lanka is planning to get on, that is with China, Indonesia and with India again. Stay tuned with us. This is your favorite political program, Public Space Sri Lanka.